What can we do to save Canada? Check it out.
I think it's important to be setting the stage for political conversations before politicians are maybe willing to take the mantle on a specific issue. And we're sort of framing an Overton window to say, hey, this can be a popular idea if you frame it this way, if you approach it this way. And that's what I think the ultimate objective is for the project.
Concepts with Shawn Whatley.
Welcome to Concepts. My name is Shawn Whatley, and today I spoke with Matt Spoke. Matt is a developer, an organizer, a community insider. He's a board member on the Canada Strong and Free Network. He's one of the big brains behind Project Ontario. He's a father of 3. He's started 2 companies, startup for 2 companies. In all of this, he has put a ton of time and effort into thinking about what it means to care about Canada, to believe in Canada, to build Canada. What does it mean to be a conservative in Canada? How should we order our lives in such a way that we end up with a country that is strong and attractive and productive and economically vibrant while still maintaining the good things of Canada in the past? So we had a fascinating discussion, and it's really neat to speak with someone who has spent years building businesses, running businesses, selling businesses, and has a deep understanding of how humans work together on a practical level. So he thinks about ideas, thinks about policies, but then he also has a ton of experience in applying those ideas and policies to real people in real life situations. And this is something that we struggle with, I think, in the broader conservative movement. We're really good at talking about ideas and talking about how we can find a new policy solution or a new policy design to fix education or community policing or healthcare. But I think we don't have the same amount of bench strength, shall we say. We talked a lot about hockey, so we don't have the same amount of bench strength when it comes to people who have real life lived experience building a company, running a company, managing people, dealing with these difficulties, and realizing the gap between theory and practice. Anyways, had a fantastic discussion. I'm so thrilled that you're listening or watching this. I'm looking forward to hearing what you think. Let's get on with the show. Matt Spoke, welcome.
Thanks for having me on, Shawn.
Oh, I really appreciate you making the time. I'm wondering if you can talk to us about your work with Project Ontario. To tell us, what it is, what the big event was, but also I want to hear about the impetus for you to put the time and effort and energy to, it's hard to plan an event. It's risky to plan an event. Yeah. So unpack that for us.
Yeah, I mean, so maybe I'll start with that first question. What is Project Ontario? We're I'd say the most formal term I could think of is a gaggle of people that share a similar frustration that Ontario seems to be drifting. If you sort of consider the role that Ontario has played historically in Canada, has been both like an economic engine, a center of culture, and a lot of these things I think are starting to drift. And there's a lot of metrics that we focus on at the project that are, economic in nature, but also things like family formation and fertility rates and other things that are indicative of, are we on the right track as a province? And the reason I care about this, one, I live in Ontario, but also if you care about Canada, Ontario is the number 1 province as it relates to population. It's the number 1 province as it relates to just absolute economic contributions to the country. And so it matters what happens in Ontario. And if we're not getting the policy right, if there are things changing in a way that we don't think is right from a cultural perspective, we wanted to highlight that. And I think the frustration sort of stems from the fact that we have an opportunity in government to make some of these changes, and maybe that opportunity seems to be partially wasted on some files where we're not making the big decisions. We're not being bold enough in some of the reforms that we think we could be pursuing as a province. And so that came together as a group of people that, frankly, have very different policy backgrounds or interests. You played a role as a contributor of a piece that we put out, a few months ago on healthcare and private surgeries in Ontario's healthcare system. But I think the general shared motivation was, let's start putting good ideas out into the public conversation around what are things that are achievable, that are ambitious but not unattainable. What should we want to see out of our daily lives as Ontarians, as parents, as taxpayers, as contributing members of society. And I think just sort of putting some definition to that is a helpful starting point to then hold policymakers accountable, to say, hey, we expect a certain standard of living. We expect a certain, better outcome for our kids than we had when we were that age. And if we're not getting those things, then that means there's something failing in our policy prescriptions. And so we ended up hosting a small event in September on this topic. We brought together about 130, 140 people in Toronto that, I'd say generally had a sensitivity to the topic that we were talking about, but really beyond the event, because we got a lot of attention for this event because it was seen as a little bit, maybe hostile or some people characterize this as being disloyal to the sitting government in Ontario, which was really not our intention. Our intention was to bring people together to talk about missed opportunities. But now it's evolving more into a series of events. We're hosting an event next week in Ottawa. We've got an event tonight, in fact, on very specific policy issue of safe supply in drugs in Toronto. And I think going into next year, it'll continue. We'll host events in different parts of the province on different topics and just sort of gather Ontarians that care about these issues. So definitely time consuming, but it's something that I think needs to be done.
Yeah. Do you think the fear of it being this subversive, what did Premier Ford say, right wing something or other of it?
Yahoos, radicals, yeah.
Yeah. Do you think that rhetoric has toned down at all and now people are just saying, yeah, no, these are actually thoughtful people who want to have a better life in Ontario?
Yeah, I don't know that the rhetoric has changed from the government. For what it's worth, I consider us sort of like an annoying thorn in their side more than anything else. Like I think it's quite easy for them to just ignore us if they want to, and that's fine. I mean, I think we are giving a venue for people that have certain concerns to voice those concerns. I think in most other contexts politically in Canada, particularly federally, but this is also true in other provinces, the role of third-party political organizations is very important. I think it's important for people to be gathering to talk about ideas, to sometimes complain about a government's policy track record or agenda in a way that is constructive, in a way that is a voice of accountability. You get elected by the electorate, and then we don't really chime in, and other than that once every 4 or 5 year election cycle on, hey, do we agree with what you're doing or do we not agree with what you're doing? I think it's important that there be more consistent and constant conversations about the policy agenda that our leaders are pursuing. And so I think that will continue to be annoying to them. But I think it's important that happen. And this is not unique to Project Ontario. I think there are other organizations that do this in all sorts of ways, right? I think of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, banging the drum on deficit spending. I think of the work that I'm involved in at Canada Strong and Free, where we just host policy conversations about, 5 years ago, we were hosting conversations about the carbon tax before it became a hot political topic. And I think it's important to be setting the stage for political conversations before politicians are maybe willing to take the mantle on a specific issue. And we're sort of framing an Overton window to say, hey, this can be a popular idea if you frame it this way, if you approach it this way. And that's what I think the ultimate objective is for the project.
Yeah. So just given your work at Canada Strong and Free, which is a fantastic outfit as well, it seems to me that our most vibrant, exciting debate and discussion happens when we're out of office. Or if the troops are saying, okay, we've been in office for a bunch of years, like in Ontario with Conservative government, and now people are saying, yeah, well, show me the money. What's going on? Show me what you guys have done. So whether it's at that point in a government or we're actually out of office or in the desert years for the late 1990s, early 2000s, that's when you have really vibrant discussion and debate. And it seems to me that we're entering a period now, I'm thinking of the new right, or what do you call them, the young conservatives, without diminishment. You've published there and I've published there. I'm not young, but they let me publish there. And so I'm wondering, you've been observing the conservative movement for decades. You're right at the center of it, being on the board of Canada Strong and Free. What are your thoughts on this this observation of mine, maybe it's an incorrect observation, that some of our vibrant debates happen when we're out of office. And then we get in office and we just clam up and say, okay, we finally got government. All of you people be quiet. We don't want any embarrassing media stories. So have you thought about that? Like, how do we maintain the vibrancy and relevancy to people's lives if we're so scared as soon as we get in office?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think the contrast between the federal conservatives and the provincial progressive conservatives is a great example. I think this need to control the message, control the policy agenda, is ultimately a weakness for elected political parties. I think over time, it just ultimately decays at your relevance because the issues change, the people change, the voters change. And if you're not, actively participating in that conversation to understand what are the animating issues of the day, and I'll say in the context of the provincial government in Ontario, the animating issues today are very different than they were 8 years ago when this government came into office, but you're still sort of operating on that same narrative, on that same set of priorities. I think ultimately that ends up being your undoing because you're just not staying in the midst of the current conversation. Particularly as it relates to like the demographic issues that I think the new right, quote unquote, as you called them, and the without diminishment crowd are highlighting, is that there is an increasing generational divide, I think, in a lot of our political issues. I think of housing and cost of living issues, among others. And that generation was not necessarily politically active, 10 years ago, 8 years ago, and maybe not even voting. Some of these people were not even legally able to vote at the time. And so they've never really been factored into the political priorities and the landscape that a government might sort of like tackle. I think this is a warning sign. I think it's probably inherently true that when you form government, you become more cautious. That to me is the undoing of a movement, because if you become more cautious the day you come into office, but when really the reason you were elected was to do big things, to take on the challenging and difficult reforms, then that cautious attitude effectively becomes your worst impediment. Like you just can't execute on your priorities because you're too worried and timid and concerned about sort of blowback. So, not something that I have a solution for necessarily, but I like seeing this. There seems to be a very active debate right now federally in conservative circles about what does it mean to be a conservative? What are the important issues? How should we orient ourselves? What is our offering to the country? I think that is healthy. I love watching and reading the debates between the Sean Spears and the Anthony Coaches of the world, because I think it forces us all to think about questions that we've otherwise ignored for a long time.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, so your point about getting into office, I've often said, I've been involved in several, we'll call them rescue missions. So other people might call them takeovers of organizations and departments. And it's a different kind of person you need standing beside you when you storm the gates, even when you enter the castle, than the kind of person that you need when you actually start running the operations of the castle and say, okay, we got to reform things, get rid of these useless committees and promote that person into another organization. But then you need a different mindset. And too often the courage and willingness to take risk involved with storming the gate is either toxic when you're managing, or you get rid of those people because they're disrupting things so much, and then you become totally scaredy cats and unwilling to say anything courageous. And
one of the things that sort of jumps to mind for me, and this is maybe a little unique about my background, I worked for 10 years as a software sort of technology entrepreneur and started a few software companies. And you hear this all the time because I was quite young. I mean, I am still relatively young, but at the time I was even younger. This is before I had kids. This is when I was in my 20s. And I think you hear this so commonly from entrepreneurs in, broadly the tech space, that there's a naiveness to being an entrepreneur that is an asset. You're going into an industry that has always operated a certain way, where there are established wisdoms and best practices. And it takes the sort of like ignorant, naive entrepreneur who doesn't know those established wisdoms to come in and say, why don't we do it differently? And everybody who's been there for 20, 30, 40 years says, you're crazy. That's not how we do it here. And often those are the ones that have the biggest impact. Those are the ones that disrupt the industries the most fundamentally. I think of Canadian examples like Wealth Simple. If Wealth Simple had asked for advice from senior executives in finance and banking 10 years ago, they would have said, you could never build a national brand to compete with RBC and Scotiabank. And it was almost pure ignorance that led them down that path and said, well, we don't know what we don't know, so we're going to try anyways. And in the process of trying, you figure it out. And in the process of figuring it out, you create a new paradigm, right? And so I think we could learn from that in politics. I think the idea that the way things have always been is the way things need to be is everywhere in politics, right? Provincially, I think of issues like choice in education, which is near and dear to my heart. This is an issue that PCs in Ontario have long considered a losing issue. And so they won't touch it with a 10-foot pole. I think that leads us down this cautious, timid path that ultimately means we don't make the changes that we fundamentally think would improve our society. So I think it'd be good to have people that are a little bit more naive going into politics and saying, I don't know what the rules are, so I'm going to try things differently.
Yeah, well said. So I think how does the famous line go? Henry Ford said if he was asked,
If I had asked customers what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. Yeah.
Yeah. Give me a faster horse.
Exactly.
So tie this together now. You have this business experience, naivety, creative destruction, break the paradigm, change things. Yeah, and so now you're really appealing to my anarcho-capitalist roots, right? Within healthcare, I think I'm more on the side of there's more that needs to be changed and burnt and torn down than protected. However, now you've got a kid or a child. Sorry, some people are offended by the term kid. You have a child. Yeah, congratulations. Awesome. I'm expecting 3 or 4 more. I always say parents, okay, you had 1 or 2, that's great, but you really don't change your parenting style until you're outnumbered. You have to be outnumbered because then you can't
I should clarify. I had my 3rd in this summer.
Awesome. Congratulations. Yeah. Oh, good.
Yeah,
so no more zone.
So I am now outnumbered. I'm outnumbered officially. Yeah.
Yeah. So you can't play man-on-man defense, right? You have to play zone defense. Yeah. No. Oh, congratulations. I'm so thankful. Yeah. So now you start to see the world through different lens. So maybe talk about that. How do we now? One person actually, I just had Anthony Kosh on yesterday, and he said he's writing a piece on post-revolutionary conservatism. So how do we exist in a world, given your work at Canada Strong and Free and the policy options that are there, your work in housing? How can you be a conservative when you see so many things around you that you want to tear down?
Yeah, I mean, that friction is very real. And I'll say, you asked me earlier, how is it that I make time to prioritize this stuff and what is it that got me to put the energy into Project Ontario? I'll say the one thing that changed in very recent history for me is becoming a father. So, I've got 3 kids, 5 years old and under, all boys. So the need for zone defense is even higher. But all of a sudden politics shifted from being academic and theoretical to being very practical. I mean, all of a sudden you see the impacts of policy in your day-to-day life, and people without kids obviously see the impacts of policies, but really you feel it way more. The moment your kids go into the education system, you see the flaws of the education system. The moment it's like having a family member who gets ill and has to deal with some part of the dysfunctional healthcare system, you start to experience the failure of policy. And so to me, it starts really fundamentally from that perspective. I know there are others that are maybe more theoretical and intellectual than I am on these issues, but I think of my conservatism as being rooted in my family, as what are the things I want for my kids? What is the society I want them to be brought up in? What are the things that, the lessons I want them to sort of like take into their young adulthood and ultimately the things that will form their character. And so when I look at like, what are the things I want to conserve, it's those things. I want to conserve, this sense of identity that makes us Canadian. I want to conserve a pride in our history. I want to conserve this recognition that duty and contribution and civic responsibility is like core to being a part of this society that we live in. Anything beyond that, that frankly just waters down the idea of parental and or family responsibility and sort of hands the reins over to the government, I think goes beyond the definition of, these institutions that we want to conserve. So in my world, and I'll say specifically on the issue of daycare, I've got 2 kids in the daycare system. My wife owns a daycare. We know this file really, really well. The government has stepped in and said, we're going to subsidize and manage daycare policy across the country. And it's a very appealing political promise, $10 daycare for everyone, universal access, et cetera. I fundamentally look at that and say, well, you're actually just stripping away responsibility that is important to be held by parents. The idea of parenthood is not to delegate that to the state. It's to make decisions and understand trade-offs and understand sort of like the importance of investing in your kids. Things being cheaper does not necessarily make them better. But it's this mindset that sort of shifts responsibility away from the individual towards the government. Those are the things that I would look to say, let's tear those things down. Let's get back to this fundamental idea of conserving the role of different participants in our society. What's the role of family? What's the role of civic society? What's the role of government? Because there is a role for government, but it's not everything. And let's conserve those roles. Anything that creeps beyond those boundaries, let's push it back.
Yeah. So that was beautiful. And I totally applaud your call to say we have to move beyond ideas and we have to move even beyond policies. And this is what gets us to one of your pieces, or the piece that I got really, really excited about. He said, I think you titled it something like, and I apologize, I don't have the title in front of me. I should have written it down. But if you really want to be a conservative, have a family. So there's ideas and policies, and then there's actions. And unless our ideas and the way we think is translating actually into a practical change in how we live, building a business, raising a family, whatever, planting a garden, having pets, learning stuff, whatever it is, conservatism is about doing something. Now that's me paraphrasing your article, but that's what got me really, really excited. I wonder if you could dilate on that about actually going out and living a conservative life.
Yeah, I mean, I that was a without diminishment contribution, and for what I love that publication exists today in Canada. I think it's such an important part of this ongoing dialogue that we're having. Yeah, the framing of the piece was quite simple. I think there's a few ways to think about starting a family as it relates to living your conservative beliefs. On the one hand, it's a shift from theoretical policy to applied policy. It's, what do I think about tax credits and education policy in theory? What do I think about it in practice? Do I like getting that check in from the CRA, once a quarter? Do I like that my kids are forced into a single education system? I see the direct impacts of policy in a way that I couldn't previously until I sort of crossed that milestone in my life. The other thing that's worth mentioning, and this might be an overgeneralization, but I found it to be true in my life, is that the conservative world is sort of constantly reminded that we are very attractive to young men, and we don't do a very good job at attracting women into our movement. I find that the one exception to that is married women with children, where all of a sudden in their lived experience, in their interactions with, the milestones of creating a family, they start to realize that they inherently agree with a lot of conservative values as well. They want to have a more, disproportionate say in the way their kids are educated. They don't want to be handheld by the nanny state. And so I actually think that from an electoral perspective, young conservative men should go get married, because young conservative men getting married is more likely to convert voters than the best marketing campaign you could imagine, targeted to women voters. And so there's a very pragmatic, and I've seen that in my life. I don't want to speak for her. I don't know that she would self-define as a conservative voter, but I know firsthand experience that my wife is a lot more conservative today than she was when we first met, before we had kids, before we got married, before life happened to us. Because I think, this old, I think it was a Winston Churchill saying of like, hey, if you're not a socialist at 20, you have no heart. If you're not a conservative by 40, you have no brain. My interpretation of that is really, before and after you have kids, before and after you've started a family. If you're not a socialist before you have a family, and if you're not a conservative after you have a family, because you're forced into the reality of trade-offs and the reality of budgeting and the reality of the economic cost of programs that sound nice in theory, but they take away from your ability to live your life the way you want to for your family and the choices you want to make. And so that was my reflection in that piece. Because I think we talk a lot about the theoretical changes we want to see in our culture. I think the biggest impact any one of us can have on our culture is to raise our kids in a reflection of the culture we want to see, because those kids end up becoming contributing members of the culture that they're going to grow into and take over one day, right? So all of these reasons, I think it's important for us to start from that point.
Yeah, brilliant. So how do we do that in our increasingly urbanized society? And what I'm thinking of is it's difficult. Like I was just complimenting you on having 3 kids. I really believe there's a material difference between 2 kids, one-on-one defense versus zone defense. You just have to have a different parenting style. And building on that, if you have, okay, I hate to talk about my own family, but I've got 4 kids. The first 2 kids, we thought we were such good parents. They're both girls. They're just so well behaved. Man, I said, this parenting stuff is easy. What's the matter with all these problem kids in school? And then my beautiful son came along. He's number 3. And it was very humbling. Not only did we go from one-on-one defense to zone defense, but we got this completely new animal. And I'll tell you one last story, and then I'll get you to respond. My mother-in-law, giant Catholic family, a whole bunch of kids, and they had 4 girls in a row. And so she was very convinced that no difference between girls and boys. They're all the same, and raised the girls like boys and vice versa. And then she had a boy, and she proceeded to do that. And she tells a story how they were walking out of their friend's house. It was wintertime up in Northern Ontario. And the little guy is just walking, I don't know, a year and a half or 2 years old, and they walked beside the tires of a truck that was in the driveway. And he stopped and he turned to the tire and he just hugged the tire. He was so happy with the tire. And she said, that's when all my presuppositions about boys and girls being exactly the same, she said, went out the window. She said, yeah, no girl that she knows and has ever seen is ever going to hug the tire of the truck. And so you mentioned reality, and just you come to grips with reality. Having kids forces you to see the world through a different lens, especially having more than 2 kids, as we've just discussed. How can we give people that opportunity to experience reality beyond a world that is really focused on me? I said I was winding down, but Andy Crook said, Southern Ontario is the most individualistic part of the Canada. You don't have to depend on neighbors or friends or anything. You can just be your own person, totally isolated. So have you turned your mind to how do we develop conservative thinkers, conservative people, conservative voters in an urbanized environment?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I'll say, I lived in Toronto up until this summer and just recently moved out to Georgetown. So not too far out of Toronto, but very different, community than living in a more urban part of the city. I still work in Toronto every day. I'm still building housing in Toronto every day. And so I sort of see both worlds firsthand. I'll say it feels to me like there's a very sort of vicious cycle that happens, which is that the fewer children we have, the less reason we have to be connected to our neighbors, to our communities. Because, people who've experienced this sounds so obvious, but often the fastest way to make friends is just talking to parents on the sidelines of a soccer game or at the hockey arena, or because, they're going through the same motions as you at the same stage of life as you, and they might be neighbors on your street and your kids are kicking a ball together, and that's how you connect. The moment you take that away, then there's less reason to just reach out to a stranger. They might be your neighbor, they might be a coworker, whatever. And I find that creates this sort of, I think some people have called it this like loneliness epidemic that I think frankly the only solution to is to rediscover the idea of community, rediscover the fact that like neighbors mean more than just sharing an address on the same street. And it doesn't need to be a massive cultural upheaval to get us there. I mean, I'll use the anecdote of we just moved out to our street in Georgetown 4 months ago. And we intentionally moved out there because we wanted to live on a dead end street. We wanted a park nearby for the kids. We wanted, we have a forest behind our house, all these great things for 3 growing boys. And we got on our street, we started meeting a few neighbors, and we realized the neighbors didn't all know each other very well. And, ironically, many of them are Toronto transplants. They've moved out of the city over the last few years. And we started a WhatsApp group. And we're new to the street. Everybody else has lived there. And we started a WhatsApp group, and we walked around and we invited our neighbors to this WhatsApp group. Now we've got 22 of our neighbors in a little WhatsApp group. And now all of a sudden people are chatting about, hey, watch out, there's a coyote walking through the park. Hey, does anybody know if this week's garbage or recycling pickup? And ultimately, this is only 3-4 weeks old, but it took us, and not to pat myself on the back, but it took us as newcomers to the street to create this format for people to connect. And I think the impact of that is worth highlighting, because one person deciding to prioritize community can have an impact on 20, 50, 100 people around them. You don't need everybody to wake up and sort of prioritize that, because I think people are willing to be invited in as neighbors and as friends and as community members, but they may not be willing to be the inviter. They're waiting for somebody to invite them in. And so I think this would go hand in hand with that piece I wrote for Without Diminishment. Like, don't be afraid to be the person to initiate that, because often on the other side is a person that's waiting for somebody to initiate that point of contact, right? I think that's the only way you get back to community, is people deciding to do it for themselves. But
yeah, brilliant. It reminded me of, I can't remember if it was in an article or a business lecture, where you've probably seen these scatter plots of the connectors in the community. And someone who's a connector, especially in a business community, they'll have, 1,000 connections. They know everybody everywhere. And most people on the scatter plot aren't those connectors. And so it takes someone like you to, of course I'd do this. Of course I'd set up a WhatsApp chat group, whereas that's foreign to everybody else on the street. And so until connectors are actually just doing what comes naturally to them, community suffers. And so building on that, though, so we want to encourage people to do it and do what comes naturally. However, it seems also to require a baseline level of trust. And so I wonder if you have reflected on that. You've looked for a safe neighborhood, right? So you must have thought about safety and trust. And can you even build community if you're worried that talking to your next door neighbor means now they know when you come home from work and that you're living alone and they might be able to rob you? So have you turned your mind to the issue of social trust?
Yeah, and I mean, I think part of this, fundamentally boils down to, like, do we have a shared sense of culture and cohesion? Because particularly in an increasingly diverse urban Canada, you can't take for granted that what I understand to be a common etiquette between neighbors is what my neighbor understands to be a common etiquette between neighbors. And I think that's something that we've definitely lost over the last, decade plus. And I think where I share a lot of the same views as folks that have been, maybe critical of recent increases in immigration and things like that. I think fundamentally I'm a very pro-immigrant person, but I think you need to have a very concrete definition of, like, what are you joining when you come to Canada, and when you're joining our communities, and when you're moving into our streets, and when you're participating in this sort of neighborly community that various parts of the country are going to have different versions and flavors of this. But ultimately, that trust that you're talking about starts from a shared understanding of what it means to be a neighbor, what it means to look out for each other, to look out for each other's kids. You used to see these signs all over the place, which now I think are more, remnants of the past than they are real. These community watch signs in neighborhoods where people legitimately would look out the window for, untrustworthy looking folks, and they'd call their neighbors and say, hey, watch out, there's a car parked on the street. We don't know who it is. I think a lot of that has sort of gone away. So I do think we need to come back to that. But I also think that we probably lean in a little bit too heavily into this fear factor. Because I think the starting point is just an olive branch to a neighbor, even if they do come from a different cultural background. If you want them to integrate, if you want them to call it join the, this sort of broad Canadian identity, then you need to be the one to show them what that means. You need to be the one to, extend the olive branch, be a welcoming neighbor, show them what being a friendly Canadian is all about. I think to grumble about them not being like us, but also not taking that first step to invite them in, is a failure on our part, right? So for everybody who complains about immigration, my response is, well, have you done your part to pull these people in? It's a two-way street, right? And I think there's probably too much emphasis placed on the things that are different and the things that divide us. The reasons we should be mistrusting of people on our streets in our cities. To use an extreme example, I used to live in Toronto in Bloor West Village, and there was a homeless man who's like sort of a known face in the community because he was always sitting in front of the same bank branch on the same corner. And, not great that we're having to see that every day with our kids, but frankly, he was an incredibly friendly man. And every time I walked by with my kids, they said hi, he said hi. And there was no need to be fearful. I wouldn't let my kids go play nearby on their own. They're young, but there was a way to turn that into an opportunity to actually create a friendly environment in that neighborhood, even if it's a homeless man sitting on the street, right? So,
no, great comments. And it reminds me, so this is something that I try to say at every opportunity. If you and I were dumped, or you and I and 100 of our friends were dumped into a country where we didn't speak the language, didn't know the culture, didn't know how to get groceries, didn't know where to live, we would probably all hang out together and say, okay, did you find a good apartment block? Great. Let's all go there. And okay, so I'll babysit your kids, you babysit. That is normal human behavior. And so it makes no sense for us to blame the humans who have come to Canada for acting that way. That's exactly what we would do. What we have to talk about, I think, is the much more difficult task of integration or integrating people. And so you said part of the responsibility is on us. Absolutely. And I would say a big part of the responsibility is on the people overseeing these programs to say, you can't just invite 10,000 people from Northern Ireland into north of Toronto. They're all going to buy homes together and they'll just be Northern Ireland. That's normal. That's what humans do. And so you have to think about that ahead of time. And to do that, though, means you have to have a vision of Canada that you believe in and you love and you think is cool, and say, Canada is really cool. We want you to come and experience this because we think it's awesome. Check it out. Have we lost that? Do you think, or I'll tip my cards. I think the presupposition of multiculturalism says, Canada, whatever, it's not that great. We don't even care if you don't experience it because it's just all cultures are equal. And so not only is it a diss against Canada, but I don't think it's actually effective for the people coming. So I've said too much, but what are your thoughts on that? How do we integrate when we have volumes so high that it seems impossible for individuals to integrate?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, I've always been of the view that even the term multiculturalism set us up for failure from the very beginning, because I think what we actually want to see is we want to see a welcoming and compassionate and open-minded society, pluralistic, multi-ethnic, etc., but a shared sense of culture. I think you cannot create a cohesive society if there are not shared fundamental rituals, beliefs, etiquettes, things that make us commonly Canadian, right? And I think to ignore that is a very, very dangerous rope to walk, and I think is leading to the consequences that we're seeing now, where you're seeing this blowback. I think there was an era of Canadian immigration where the people who came here came willing and eager to join Canada, not to recreate their home culture, but in a suburb of Toronto, right? And I think there's a nuance there. But, what did we lose? I think fundamentally, you need to be excited about your own country for people to join you in that excitement. I think there's a loss of optimism and ambition and vision for what the country could be. And so when people come here, they come here saying, well, my way of life is equally good, if not better, than the way of life you're selling me. So why would I adapt to your way of life? And so, I think you can adjust this in policy, of course. I think you can spend a lot of time talking about how we rank applicants and our point system and, the numbers of permanent residents. all of that to me is all secondary to, have we created an ambition that people want to belong to? Again, I probably overuse analogies to the startup sort of sector, but I think of high talented employees that want to go work for that company that is changing the world. How many people are lining up to go work for SpaceX or Tesla? And I'm sure I can come up with examples that are not only Elon Musk. But you attract the best because you put your best foot forward. And I actually think that the number of immigrants we bring into the country, and this is probably going to be, not a view that all of your listeners share, is less relevant to what are they coming here for.
Yeah.
I think we can absorb a large number of immigrants if we have a shared reason, a shared purpose, a shared ambition as a country. And by coming here, they are effectively opting into that. Right now, there's nothing to opt into. So, the large numbers come with large consequences.
Yeah.
But I think there's, a better version that we could design.
Yeah. So two thoughts come to mind when you say that. We're touching on culture and vision and what people want out of life. And I often think of the difference between a game of hockey, especially pickup hockey, and you don't have any refs on the ice, and it's technically no body contact, versus someone who's come from a lacrosse background. And there's a body of knowledge that they need to know about hockey and how hockey differs from lacrosse, and the fact that you can hit people over the head with your stick in lacrosse, or maybe you can't, but you can certainly hit people with your stick. But in hockey, you just don't do that. And so the community itself has cultural norms and habits around the game of hockey. And then building on that, though, to business and industry, this is what makes me so passionate about culture, at least in my experience in leadership, in the healthcare space. Culture is everything. If you could have one sour person in your department, and they can destroy everybody's desire to work hard and stay a little later and maybe skip on a break just so that they could get the patients seen that need to be seen. George Gilder, an economist, called this the X factor. It's the difference between a winning NHL team and a losing one. It's the difference between a winning company in a war, in an army, and one that has exactly the same material, exactly the same people, maybe even bigger soldiers, but they lose and they can't accomplish a task. And it's that thing that I'm talking about when I talk about culture. And I firmly believe, at least in my experience, that culture is fostered and encouraged and set by leadership. If you have a sour, cynical leader, you know what? You're going to have a sour, cynical department. You won't have a vibrant, go-getter, risk-taking, enthusiastic culture in your startup, in your company. And I think it applies at the level of nation too. So anyways, I'm talking too much. Do you see that in your work in business?
Absolutely. I mean, I'll take your analogy a step further. I think what I found, having led to mid-sized software companies, small to mid-size, is that the other thing that went hand in hand with that idea of culture and that idea of attracting the best was this idea of autonomy and empowerment. The fact that individual contributors on a team could have a disproportionate impact if they were just given the rope to run. And if you micromanaged, and if you overly prescribed, and if you overly regimented things, then the highest performers didn't want to participate in that environment. That to me makes me think of the role of the government in terms of the functioning of our economy. I know, these days it's maybe not topical or not sexy to talk about the role of conservative policy in tax, in economic growth, in sort of like a competitive corporate environment. But I think these things are related. I think if you overly prescribe how people can succeed, how people can build businesses, how people can build homes, how people can do anything that you might want to do as an ambitious individual, you effectively are paring back their individual empowerment. You're paring back their individual ambition. And that translates to how they engage with the world. I think, entrepreneurs, business owners, these are not just important people because they contribute economically. I think they contribute culturally. They contribute to a mindset of growth They contribute to a mindset of anything is possible. Ambition is only limited by you, nothing else. And if you cap that in policy, if you cap that in tax policy, if you cap that in anti-competitive policy, regulatory policy, you cap that ambition, you cap the cultural benefits of that person or those people sort of, living their lives in society. And so I think these things are very tightly knit. I share the same view as a lot of folks, in the quote unquote new right, that, if you only focus on economic policy, only focus on tax policy, and you don't sort of take on the bigger cultural fights, then you're missing the mark. But I also think that if you're only focusing on the cultural fights and you don't realize that these things are very deeply linked, I think of myself and I just think of, my ability or limitations in building a business, not only to provide for my family, but also to have an impact in the city that I live in and the society that I spend my time in. If I could have a bigger impact, I would be a more contributing member of society. I might donate more to charity. I might inspire more entrepreneurs to try what I'm doing. I might, all these things that there are ripple effects of. But if I'm limited from that because the regulatory environment is too stringent, I can't get my business from medium size to large size, the tax policies are too punitive, then all of a sudden my ability to have a ripple effect with the people around me, and I use myself as just sort of a micro example, is smaller. Yeah. And, I think Pierre Poilievre had this narrative really well nailed during the last election. A big government leads to small individuals, and a small government leads to big individuals. And I think that there's a way to sort of translate that concept across lots of policy files. Yeah. But you need to get out of the way. You need to let people live their lives, feel empowered. And I think that translates to ambition and optimism. And I think that translates to cultural change.
Yeah. Well said. So well said. I would build on that it's not just your ability to do something or inability to do it because of regulations. But if you look at the world and you say, oh man, I have to do all that to even try to expand my business, your desire plummets, your passion evaporates. And so the single most valuable factor, I think, in society is the passion that resides inside people's hearts. And you have to allow them to pursue that passion. And so then you say, okay, Whatley, you're just a radical individualist. This is your anarcho-capitalism coming out again. And yes, and you're part of the team. So the purpose of your hockey team is to win games. You want to win games, and you will win more games when you allow people to be creative in their playmaking. Yeah. And when they're not selfish about hogging the puck all the time, there are expectations in being a part of the team. You show up for practice, even if you don't think you need to practice or you don't want to practice. You show up on time to the change room. There's a certain dress code. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about culture. And then within that culture, you celebrate creativity, you celebrate excellence, and you're there because you want to win. You want Canada to win. Now I'm starting to sound like Trump. I better stop using the word win. But what are your thoughts on that? Is that a way that we can marry this individual creativity and passion with a commitment to something that we value together? Or is that being too simplistic?
No, I think that's right. And I'll maybe the nuance that at least the way I think about it is that there's sort of two forms of individualism, the way I think of it. There's a form of individualism that focuses on how much can I get out of the system for my own benefit. And there's a form of individualism that focuses on how successful can I be in order to contribute back into the system, and the system being sort of the grander society that we live in. And I think a lot of that just comes down to this basic mindset of growth or status, and if we're living in an environment that is zero sum, then individualism leads to people effectively stealing opportunity from each other. I need that piece of the pie, so therefore you can't have that piece of the pie. If individualism is rooted in a positive sum mindset, then it actually is net positive for everyone. It grows the pie, right? So there are more pieces for other people to partake in. And so I do think that these are not contradictory concepts. The idea that you can be individualistic, like a star player on a hockey team, while also caring about your team and the success of your team and elevating the probability of the success of your team by being the best you can be individually. I think that's probably the nuance. And, I think to tie this back to the previous topic that we were talking about, the best example of that is parenthood, right? Where you go out every day and you need to earn more money, you need to succeed in your career, you need to climb, the corporate ladder, whatever it might be, in order for you to bring that back for the benefit of your family, right? I think you sort of boil that up to neighbors and community and cities and the country. I think that mindset is still the right one for the betterment of everyone.
Yeah, brilliant. Well said. So second last question, and I'm glad you pulled it back to where we started. So obviously you have your own podcast, so you know how these things work. You want to bring the plane to ground. So this is the second last question. And I tweeted posted your article on X with accolades about if you want to be conservative, start a family. And I didn't tell you this. I should have warned you, but don't worry. It's not scary. You don't have to worry about it. So someone texted me, won't say who it is. And this is someone who won't have kids, will never have kids anyways. And so this person said, "That's terrible. How could you tweet that? You are excluding me from the conservative movement." And they're part of the conservative movement. And I said to them, no, that's not what's going on. This is aspirational. This is saying this is something we should celebrate and not a way to exclude people. So what would your response be to that? And maybe you would just be, "Oh yeah, great response, Shawn." That's what I would have said. But how do we offer an aspirational vision? Come on, let's climb the mountain. Well, I have no legs. I can't climb the mountain. How dare you talk about climbing the mountain? How do we answer that?
Yeah, no, I think I got similar comments, for what it's worth, when I published that piece. I think there's a big difference, and maybe the way I framed it was intentionally pointed towards individual people making individual choices about their own desire for children. I think really it boils up to a more macro point that we should aspire to be a society that is so optimistic about the future that as a society, we are creating children. Individuals can make their own choices. Do you want 1 kid, 0 kids, 5 kids? I don't think that is necessarily the point I was trying to make. But I do think whether you're a person wanting to have a family or not, for whatever reasons, or you can't have a family because there's something limiting you from that, that doesn't mean that you should not share in the view that act of contributing to the future by having children is a positive thing for society. And I don't think we should shy away from that. In policy, in our rhetoric, I don't think that it should be seen as exclusionary to say we have policy that is encouraging and maybe even promoting a family formation, even though not everybody is going to benefit from that policy. There's lots of policies that we have that benefit one group over another. And in those cases, I go back to this idea that there's an individualism that is net, negative in terms of I take from the system, and there's individualism that is net positive, that is I contribute to the system. I'd much rather see us promoting this, this individualism that contributes back. So if that means that families get lower tax rates, or if that means that families get, preferential policy in one way or another, I think that's to everybody's benefit, not just the family itself or the people that decided to have kids. I think the most, I'm sure somebody more intelligent than me said this in a more elegant way, but I've seen several quotes along the lines of the most significant thing you can do as a reflection of your optimism is have children. If you are optimistic about the future, you have children. Doesn't mean everybody needs to have children. Just means it is a reflection of an optimistic society that they are having children. And if we are not having children, there's a reflection that we see the future as being worse than the past, and we're living it out in our actions. And I think that's the state that we're currently at, frankly.
Yeah. Beautiful. It's so beautiful. I'm scared to actually make a comment about it because I agree. There's a sense of hope and optimism involved there.
And chaos and unpredictability exactly, and everything else. But yeah.
I'm trying to think of my own kids. Was it really optimism, or did they just happen?
Yeah.
So part of the thought that struck me was, Yoram Hazony. So he's kind of a big name in the national conservative movement in the States and elsewhere. There are many good things he says. Some things I'm just like, I don't know if I really am aligned with that. But one of the things he said is that if we focus continually on freedom, just go, be free, do whatever you want, sky's the limit, no guardrails. He said young people don't go out and start a business. They don't build a career. They don't find someone to start a family with. They don't have kids. They don't take risks. They stop. They stop doing everything. They stop being human. And so part of having families, whether we want to admit it or not, is involved with the expectations of the community that you're part of. So in your community where people say, yeah, it's normal for you to have kids and take them to hockey or soccer or whatever. Yeah, of course you'd want to have a house with a park behind it because that's kind of what you expect parents to want and to do. And that's a good way to raise your kids, right? Where they're outside a lot. So those expectations chafe against the libertarian in us. And I say this as I call myself a reformed libertarian, just no expectations, man. I don't want my mom telling me what to do. But to have a thriving society, we have these expectations. We expect you to grow up, get an education, find someone you want to spend your life with, build a family, build a business, build a career. So how do you think that expectations play a role in building families? I promised you that was I wasn't going to ask you another question, and there I did. So that I promise is my second last question. Are there expectations?
No, I think, yeah. I mean, I think the idea of there's two thoughts that come to mind. One, the idea that freedom is independent of duty or responsibility, I think leads to a lot of negative outcomes. These sort of like hyper individualistic sort of lifestyles. And I think the other thing that we've done for probably the last generation or two is we've lied to ourselves in that absolute freedom leads to happiness, leads to just a satisfaction. I think, and this is probably where we could be more honest about the fact that, you could have the most free, flexible, individualistic life and find yourself quite lonely and purposeless and rudderless at the end of your life. And with duty and responsibility comes purpose and satisfaction and fulfillment. And children's not the only way to accomplish that. I think people do this in many ways in their lives, starting businesses and having careers they care about. But the most enduring is really having a family that you feel accountable to and responsible for. And I think from that, humans derive purpose, right? And I think without purpose, we all sort of like float in the wind, right? So I think we do need to be more explicit that there are expectations tied to this sense of freedom, not only expectations to society, but also to our families. I think one of the saddest things I see increasingly these days is people in their 60s and 70s whose kids are choosing not to have kids. And I'm like, they did nothing wrong. They had 3-4 kids themselves, and now they're gonna, in some cases having 0 grandkids because the social norms and expectations have changed in a way that I think is quite selfish. And you're creating this new lonely generation, which is the would-be grandparents that never got there, right? And so, I do think we need to put more emphasis on that. And out of that duty, I think comes this idea that duty to your family translates to duty to your neighbors, to duty to your community. And I think ultimately is the foundation of a cohesive culture in the country. So if we get that building block right, we'll start to see things shifting in the right direction. But
yeah, brilliant. Thoughts on duty too. Something that is very much within sort of the nerdy aspects of liberalism is the idea that you have no involuntary obligations in your life. You and I enter business, we agree to a contract. If you don't hold up your end of the bargain, contract's over. And so there is that level of freedom. Shall we say, okay, you decide to get married or you don't, or you decide to have children or you don't. But once you have kids, there's a whole boatload of involuntary obligations. You can't just go back in time and pretend like you don't have kids, or go back in time and pretend you were never married. I mean, you are obligated in ways that you could never, ever imagine. So there's a boatload of involuntary.
And I think that's a good thing. And I think we frame it You know, I see this. I'm of that generation where I've got friends deciding to have kids, having kids late, deciding not to have kids.
Yeah.
And the first question always comes to mind, like, oh, I'm giving something up. I'm losing something by having kids, by taking that step. And that seems to become the normal rhetoric, as opposed to I'm gaining something. I'm expanding my horizons as an individual by going down that path. So, yeah.
So what have we missed? What should we be thinking about in Canada?
I mean, the one thing that I'll say that I'm increasingly spending time thinking about is the role of education broadly as it relates to our culture. Obviously, very specifically, I see my oldest son now is in the public education system, and so I'm seeing it for the first time. And you know, I think there's lots of things we could say, and I don't want to go down a rabbit hole about the quality and sort of incentives within our public education system. But I will say, as it relates to this broader cultural conversation, we have to get education right. You know, maybe there's something to be said about this generation, our generation. You know, we've got our hand, we're going to play our hand, and we can't really go back and change that. But the next generation, you know, what views are they absorbing in schools? What perspective are they going to take into their adulthood? I think all of those things are so heavily formed at the youngest ages when they're going through our education system. And so I don't think of education purely as like, are our kids learning math and are they learning, you know, their multiplication tables and their Canadian history? I think of it more as like, what kind of adults are we manufacturing? Are they critical thinkers? Are they being taught things that are negative and you know, sort of self-deprecating? And I think solving education is the solution long-term to a lot of our problems. Because a 6-year-old today is a 40-year-old in the future who's contributing to society, or a 30-year-old or a 25-year-old. So I don't think that we put enough emphasis on the importance of education, not just like how much are our teachers paid and are we passing our EQAO standard tests, but what kind of citizens are we creating? I think there should be a lot more emphasis put on that from the quote-unquote new right, cultural conservative movement. Like we cannot abandon that as a lost battle to the left and just move on to the next issue, because I think it's such a fundamental issue that we need to figure out how to tackle it.
Wow. What kind of adults are we manufacturing? That was brilliant. Matt Spoke, thank you so much. Thank you for all the work that you do.
Thanks a lot, Shawn.